Hello, everyone. Welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I am the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, Prints and Murals by Black Artists in the WPA, we are joined by Clare Kobasa, the Assistant Curator for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, and the museum's Study Room Manager, and Victoria McCraven, the museum's 2020-2021 Romare Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow. Thanks for being here today, Clare and Victoria.
Thank you, Jessica. It's exciting to be here, and thank you all for joining us for this presentation. So the Great Depression left many in the United States mired in an economic collapse that Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought to address with the passage of the New Deal, a series of initiatives and programs that included the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA of our title, that were meant to provide jobs for Americans, including musicians, writers, actors, and the subject of our talk today, visual artists. So founded in 1935 as a branch of the WPA, the Federal Arts Project oversaw a variety of projects for painters and printmakers, among others. And in addition to providing employment, the FAP was also meant as a vehicle to make art more widely available as part of daily life across the nation. So this goal informed the production of art made for or circulated to post offices, libraries, prisons, and hospitals, as we'll see today.
And in 1943, the St. Louis Art Museum actually received a large allocation of works from the Works Progress Administration in Chicago, including paintings, prints, drawings, watercolors. And many of these works make up the first by African-American artists to enter the museum's collection. So we're going to start by talking about this work here, Mural Panel by Selma Day. So Selma Day was born in 1907 in New York. Her mother was a dressmaker and her father was a chauffeur. And she attended and graduated from Brooklyn College. During her time in New York, she crossed paths with artists such as Augusta Savage and Selma Burke. And she worked as a decorator for W&J Sloan on Fifth Avenue. And in 1958, she moved from New York to New Jersey, where she eventually passed away in 1994. And in thinking about this work by Selma Day, this oil on panel, we're going to understand a bit more about what went into these allocations and these works by the WPA. So as we can see here, there is a central head of a cow, and there is a corn stalk that is winding around the head of this cow and is weaving into this winding fence. And this is a work you wouldn't immediately identify as a WPA work. It's not showing a scene of industry or a classic American landscape, but a work like this, showing a children's story or narrative, wasn't unheard of during the WPA arts projects because they were public allocations and public art. So often a universalizing scene like this was something that you would see potentially in a mural, which is an idea we're going to further explore. Can you do next slide, please? So this is a picture of Selma Day in 1938 in Harlem, New York. And this is the same year as the mural panel that you just saw. And actually, if you Google Selma Day, this is one of the only images that you will find of her. She's not very well documented, but in doing some research, we were able to find out a bit more about her life and potentially where this mural panel may have been sourced from. So Day, working in New York City, she was working at one of 4 predominantly Black WPA centers that were functioning during the New Deal era. Her, Selma Day, working at the Harlem Community Art Center. Another art center was the Southside Community Art Center in Chicago, the Federal Arts Project Graphic Arts Division Workshop in Philadelphia, which you'll hear a bit more about later in the presentation, and the Playhouse Settlement at Caramu House in Cleveland. And in some of these centers, we saw Black and white artists in the New Deal era working together, but these are predominantly Black centers that we will study further today. And especially in New York, where Day was working, the Harlem Community Art Center helped to continue a lot of the energy that was coming from the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the most well-known projects was the Harlem Hospital WPA mural project, which was the first major US government commission awarded to African Americans in 1936. Can you, next slide, please? And here's another image here of a photograph of Mother Goose, which Selma Day was painting in the previous image. And of the 6 designs that were originally submitted, only 2 were accepted, one by Elba Lightfoot and the other by Selma Day. And those were the 2 designs that were set to be in the nursery, showing children's nursery rhymes. And 4 of the initial sketches were denied originally on the grounds that they were potentially too Afrocentric. And actually, artist Charles H. Alston, who was a supervisor of the Harlem Hospital project, he filed discrimination charges to get his murals approved for the Harlem Hospital project. And so you can see from this work here, Mother Goose, it draws from the beloved stories of the Mother Goose nursery rhymes. Next slide, please. And what we suspect is that the mural panel that we have here at the St. Louis Art Museum might be sourced from a Mother Goose nursery rhyme, hey diddle diddle. And then the nursery rhyme goes as this: hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. So we see a person here playing a musical instrument, and we also see again this cow figure here, and you see 2 small sheep jumping over a stream. And if we go back to the image that we have originally in our collection, you can see some similarities between the 2 works. So we think that potentially this was either a study before this mural was done in 1938 or a work afterwards, but also portraying Mother Goose. As you can see, you have this leg of a lamb just kind of truncated there. So it was really interesting doing this research and learning more about the murals. Unfortunately, many of the murals were in jeopardy because they portrayed images that people were not very happy with. But recently, there was some restorative work done on these murals, which is in the chat below. So you can read more about that if you're interested. However, we believe the mural that Selma Day completed has not been restored, unfortunately. So, but if you are interested in learning more about it, you can find out about it on that link. Next, I'd like to introduce Claire, who's going to talk a bit more about another one of the print workshops in Philadelphia.
Yeah, Victoria. So now we will move a bit south to Philadelphia, which was one of 5 print workshops that were established from across the United States under the Federal Arts Project. And print as a medium enjoyed a particular reputation for being a very democratic art form because it could be made in multiple, it was easy to circulate, it was much cheaper. And so there was a large interest in increasing both the number of artists who were working in this medium and also the kind of accessibility to the public of prints of various kinds. And one of the artists that we're going to talk about today is the man here pictured on the left, Dox Thrash, was born probably in 1892 in Griffin, Georgia. He left as a teenager and traveled before landing in Chicago, where he studied various kinds of art practice at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago before serving in the army during World War I. He went to France and was wounded, returned to Chicago and continued taking art classes full time for a couple of years, and then began traveling again before landing in Philadelphia around 1925. So at that point, he was already a quite highly trained artist, but one medium he hadn't really explored was that of printmaking, and Philadelphia was a great place to start. So he began taking classes with Earl Horter at the Graphic Sketch Club, where he learned both etching and aquatint, which were 2 techniques he explored sort of great success. And we'll look at one example of his work here in this piece called Heave, where he's really used these kind of contrasts of inkiness to great effect to create this drama that imbues almost a kind of spirituality to the scene of fishermen. And so an etching is a print that's made using a copper plate, which is then coated with a sort of resin surface, and then using a needle or some other kind of sharp tool, lines are drawn into that surface, revealing the copper beneath, so that when acid is placed over it, the acid only eats away at those lines that have been revealed. And so you can see them very clearly, for example, say in the apron of the figure to the right, or the way that the lines are moved closer together to create areas of darker tone above. And then the other technique that Dox Thrash employs in this print is something called aquatint, which you can see in the clouds above. And this was a way of applying a sort of powder to the plate that would then be melted and etched and allow for these gradations of tone. And so this sort of intense interest in the surface of the plate and the manipulations that were possible there really inform one of Thrash's most remarkable achievements, which is the invention of the carborundum mezzotint, which is a technique that he developed with Hugh Meisbov and Michael Gallagher, who were two other printmakers also working in Philadelphia at the Fine Print Workshop at that time. And so I'm going to read how Thrash himself describes the effect of carborundum, which is essentially a kind of grit that was used to clean off the surface of lithographic stones, which we'll see a little later, but would not previously have had any use in kind of the intaglio process the way he adopted it here. So Thrash says, the carborundum plows up the plate, making little bits of metal stick up like hills. To draw on the plate, all you have to do is take a burnisher and smooth out the parts you want to register light on the paper. The hills you leave will register as black because they will catch most of the ink. You can make your hills and valleys of different depths all over the plate and get all sorts of shades blending into one another. And so in this print here entitled Charlotte, you can see how he's worked from dark to light. So everywhere that he's smoothed out is what becomes the lightest part of the print. And he has this kind of recognition of the subject that he's able to translate into the very subtle modeling and the almost glowing form that he creates in this print. And the Federal Arts Project was very excited about the development of this new medium. And so it was advertised quite widely. And eventually, not initially, but a few years later, Thrash did start to receive more attention as the inventor and as one of the most sort of adept practitioners of this new medium. And so this work was included in a 1939 exhibition in Baltimore that Alan Locke curated. And then Thrash's work also ended up here in St. Louis in 1942. So as I mentioned earlier, the FAP also organized circulating exhibitions that would travel all over the country. So people in a variety of cities could see what was happening in other parts of the US. And I will say that printmakers also seem to have had a fair amount of freedom in choosing their subject matter. And so both with Thrash and then with Steth, it's interesting to look at the way these artists kind of turned to their own lives and experiences and portrayed those in print. So Thrash was not the only African-American printmaker in the Philadelphia workshop, although he was the first. There's sort of a second generation as well, including Raymond Steth, who was born in 1917 in Norfolk, Virginia, and moved as a fairly young child to Philadelphia. And so Steth was someone who was trained as an artist, but did not seem to have had much experience with printmaking before he entered the workshop. And while he also experimented with the mezzotint and with etching, he really kind of found his sort of his love in lithography. And you can see him working here on the lithographic stone. And so what a lithograph is, again, so the surface is a stone rather than a plate of metal. And then the artist draws or writes or makes any kinds of marks on that in a kind of waxy crayon or wash. The stone's then treated and dampened so that when ink is applied, it only adheres to the marks that the artist has made. And so for someone who's trained as a painter, as a draftsman, it's in some ways a very easy kind of transition to make into printmaking. And Steth is very much in keeping with the time in a certain way, in that during the WPA, the New Deal era, lithography becomes more widely celebrated as an artistic form of printmaking and not just as one kind of for newspapers or other sort of circulating materials. And now I will turn it over to Victoria again to talk a little bit about Steth's work.
So here we're looking at a really incredible lithograph, Beacons of Defense. And as Claire was saying, Raymond Steth was working under printmaker Dox Thrash, but he went on to also found his own Photographic School of Art, and he was assistant teacher at the Philadelphia College of Art and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But this work here, I think it captures the spirit of the WPA artworks, and that you have so many people working towards this common mission of preparing for the war. And in that way, there is that democratization of work that we see with the WPA, with every person contributing in their own way. So you see smoke clouds that bend into waves of the water here, and just how the scene moves. You see navy yards, oil fields, factories, and textile mills. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a scene of people mining. There's a small rural scene, and there's really just many forms of transportation that are being shown here. And in the two bottom right-hand corners, you have two lights that are overlapping and are showing the contributions of America and of Americans presenting these works. And actually, go to the next slide, please. In the upper right-hand corner, we can see two people, potentially designers, working on a sketch. So showing that even though the people who are working in maybe the arts field, or who are sketching or drawing or potentially drafting for a plane, or it's not quite clear exactly what they're doing, but we can see that everyone is contributing in an equal way and their work is being valued. Next slide, please. And the last work we want to take a look at today is the evolution of swing, which by Raymond Steth, which shows the contributions of Black Americans to our current understandings of American culture. And this print is based on a drawing that Steth used in his application to the Federal Arts Project. And you can see these lines of electricity leading from the upper left-hand corner downward through the frame. And you see energy and connectivity. So you see that electricity going through the two figures dancing in swing, all the way to the bottom right-hand corner, where we see figures dancing potentially on the African continent. And you see the movement of people to the West, showing transatlantic slavery, but also showing that there are positive contributions by African Americans to the United States, which was a huge part of what many of these artists were trying to convey during this time period of the New Deal era. To conclude, arts during this time period were both national, in that it was a national effort, but they were also quite local. And we see that here in St. Louis as well, in the development of arts here and throughout the country, in which these workshops were really places that people could find community, but also training in the fine arts. The St. Louis Art Museum actually received a grant from the WPA in 1938. And though in general, there is little record keeping of the WPA, we have these images of proof of what was produced during this time period. We have a lot of the photographs that documented the processes that artists developed, such as the carborundum mezzotint, and also just the development of an expanded idea of what America could be, seeing that these works were not just for a rich patron, but for the country. Thank you so much for attending today. We are open to questions. There's a lot of research that's gone behind this, so definitely ask us some more questions if you have them.
Wonderful, great. Yeah, so please type in any questions you have into that Q&A box on your screen. And in the meantime, so you mentioned that some of these or all of these at some point were exhibited. I mean, you mentioned at least one of them were exhibited. Were these also used in other ways? So were they ever used as like promotional things? You know, are there dual use for any of these that you know of?
So that's one of the big questions that we're still sort of sorting together, both the specific impressions that arrived at the St. Louis Art Museum, so the group that we have here and their exhibition history, and then these interesting questions about the wider circulation of the prints. And so we do know that some of these have been on display at various points in the museum's history, not too many, but a few, and that they did also function in some of them in an educational context as well. So Victoria was mentioning the community art centers that were another kind of facet of this bigger project of bringing arts into daily life. And so oftentimes they were either just put on display there or kind of brought into the classroom as models for students to learn from. Victoria, I don't know if you want to.
Yes, and I would say as well that some of these prints that we showed today are quite well known nationally. So for example, on the screen right now, Evolution of Swing and Charlotte, those are in the collections of a number of other museums and have been part of very prominent exhibitions of WPA work. So to see that they've been in the paper, even historically, is really exciting for us as we were doing that research.
Yeah, and maybe I'll take this brief moment to do a little PSA, which is to say, so we've shown you some of what we have, but not all of what we have. And if you would like to come see more of the prints and drawings from the WP allocation or anything else in the collection, paper@slam.org is how to reach me and make an appointment and come visit.
Yeah, it's a really great, I mean, you're able to see them up close, closer than you would if they were hanging on the walls at the museum. So highly recommend. Okay, so we have some other questions here. Someone would like to know if you were able to talk more about the grant that the St. Louis Art Museum received, if you know any more about that.
Yes, so St. Louis Art Museum, or the City Art Museum at the time, if you look in the paper, that's the name that we were known by, received a grant in 1938 for the preparation of charts and diagrams illustrating methods used in creating art objects and for indexing the museum's artworks. So that is what that was printed at the time in 1938 for why the museum would have received the grant.
Great. Did you have anything else for that, Claire?
Oh, I think that was
okay, perfect. All right. Can you talk more about the specifically African American WPA FAP centers? Do we know how they were founded?
So they're all a little bit different. I mean, the interesting thing about talking about WPA and FAP, as Victoria was sort of alluding to in her or saying very clearly in her conclusion, is that while it's a national effort, what happens on a local level looks very different, kind of wherever you find yourself. And so maybe Victoria, I'll let you talk a little bit about Harlem.
Yes. So at the Harlem Art Center, you have the Harlem Renaissance that's happening at the time period, and you have a number of pretty prominent artists that were already working there, and artists that had a lot of community pull. As I mentioned, Augusta Savage was pretty well known there. And if you go, you can see a lot of exhibitions that were prominently featuring Black artists and the community that was being surrounded by that. Whereas, say, as maybe Claire can talk about now, the Philadelphia Art Center had a bit of a different start and a different focus. Rather than all media, it was focused primarily on prints.
Right. So there was the fine print workshop, and then there were other kind of other, not quite centers, but like designations for people who were sculptors or people who worked in easel painting, or the poster workshop. The print workshop does seem to have been a little bit unusual. Well, it was unusual as being a fine print workshop in that context. And in that case, it seems to have, I think, both a little bit of what Victoria was saying of kind of the history of arts production and the access that Black artists did have to some degree in Philadelphia, which was not the same as New York, but there were people like Tanner who were kind of known in the city. And so it was essentially up to the kind of supervisors of each workshop or each like local area to decide who would be hired. And so in Philadelphia, they seem to have been very open, and they legally they were supposed to, they weren't meant to be barriers to hiring. Although that wasn't always true kind of in the South. I think the FAP did maintain segregated facilities from what I remember reading. So I think it was a combination of, in Philadelphia, of kind of who was there, and then an openness. And once there was kind of the ball rolling, the support, I would imagine, of knowing people and bringing them into the workshop as well. And then Karamu House was a settlement house that predated the WPA, and then received money and was able to expand. So they started as primarily a theater organization. So yeah, it's sort of each story is a little bit different, but equally fascinating and worth learning more about.
Kind of going along in that same vein, someone asks, does the People's Art Center in St. Louis fit in the conversations with the Harlem and the Philadelphia Art Center in the WPA context? Do you know?
Yes, we know entirely too much. So I will just very briefly distinguish. So in Philadelphia, it was a fine print workshop, and so everyone hired there was a professional artist. So Philly already had a variety of art schools, and so there doesn't seem to have been the same impetus to create a community arts center the way there was in Chicago or New York or St. Louis. Yes, the People's Art Center has a lot to do with the works that were on view. So the St. Louis Art Museum actually within this allocation, as Victoria mentioned at the beginning, received 2 allocations, one that was for use at SLAM and one that was for use at the People's Art Center. And the prints couldn't be sent directly there because it wasn't a tax-funded organization. It was privately funded at that point because once the WPA closed down in 1943, so the People's Art Center opened in 1942, very excited, grand ambitions. WPA shuts down in 1943 and they have to fundraise extensively to stay open. So SLAM essentially received this group of works, which includes all of the works you see on the screen, for use at the People's Art Center. And at the time, Charles Nagel, who is the acting director here, was also the president of the board. And so there were quite close connections early on in the history between SLAM and the PAC. And there's lots, I mean, Victoria, to say whatever else you
And there are definitely records of work by artists that are at these more major centers, or for example, in Chicago or in Philadelphia, their works being shown here in St. Louis and being in the paper, encouraging people to visit these prints, for example, at the People's Art Center. We are still doing a lot of research on how these different works moved from the St. Louis Art Museum to the People's Art Center. And it really just shows that there was a lot of excitement around what was coming out of the WPA, and specifically for Black artists at the time. And there was also a lot of conversation with local St. Louis artists that were coming out of the People's Art Center, but also people who were completely separate to that art center that were in the arts community here in St. Louis.
Yeah, great, thank you. All right, I think this is going to be our last question. Are there books available about these artists that would be a good resource for high school art teachers?
Yes. Victoria, do you have any favorites? I'm looking to see if I can grab some.
I would say that I'd most recommend anything that's been written by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, because they have the largest collection of the Dox Thrash, the Raymond Steth prints. I think a lot of it is a lot of individual research. Unfortunately, for like what I've done on Selma Day with a special help from assistant curator Amy Torbert. So a lot of it has been ancestry.com, newspapers.com, but in terms of the most well-known artists, I would say anything that's been published by the PMA.
So there's a 2001 catalog, which for a while I was like, oh, that's so recent. And now it's actually about Dox Thrash. And that was a great resource for us. And then there are a lot of exhibition catalogs where you find kind of individual entries on some of the artists. So there's definitely, there are resources out there.
Great, well, and it sounds like there's still plenty to be found, right? Plenty of information to be found still. All right, well, thank you both. This was really interesting and great, and it's I did have someone request that there be an exhibition on these prints that we have. So Claire, I think it just gave you a job. So there's great interest. So thank you. All right, well, and thanks to everyone here who joined us today. If you'd like, register to join me next Thursday, July 29th at 7 p.m. to hear a conversation with panelists Donna Levy, Shiraz Gorman, Michael Allen, Gwen Moore, and Hannah Clem about the concepts of preservation, removal, and regrowth in conjunction with the exhibition Currents 119, Donna Levy. You can register for that program and more at slam.org/events. And thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.